Picture this, a summer evening in 1814. The cobblestones of London are still warm from the day's heat, children playing in narrow alleyways, mothers calling them home for supper. The gentle hum of a city winding down after another day of survival. In an unforgiving world. And then, chaos. In the span of just 3 hours, this peaceful neighborhood would transform into a battlefield. Windows shattered, doors torn from their hinges, blood on the streets, families torn apart by violence so sudden, so inexplicable, that even today, over 2 centuries later, it defies belief. The cause, not political upheaval, not economic collapse, not even war. A pig, a single, intoxicated pig. This is the story of how one animal's drunken rampage exposed the raw nerves of a society on the brink. How class warfare, desperation, and human nature collided in the most unexpected way imaginable. How a simple farm animal became the catalyst for one of the most bizarre riots in British history. But before we dive into the chaos, before we witness the destruction, we need to understand the powder keg that was Victorian England. Because this wasn't just about a pig. This was about people desperate, angry, forgotten people who had been pushed to their absolute breaking point. And sometimes, all it takes is one small spark to ignite an inferno. To understand how a drunken pig could start a riot, we must first understand the world it stumbled into. London, 1814. The Napoleonic Wars were finally ending. But victory came at a price that would haunt an entire generation. Imagine walking through the streets of Southwark on that fateful summer day. The air was thick with smoke from countless chimneys. The Thames, that great lifeline of the city, choked with the waste of progress. And everywhere, the faces of the forgotten. Unemployment had reached catastrophic levels. Soldiers, once heroes on foreign battlefields, now begged for scraps in the very streets they had fought to protect. Factories that had boomed during wartime now stood silent, their workers cast aside like broken tools. But it wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about hope, about the crushing realization that surviving the war meant nothing if you couldn't survive the peace. The working classes lived in conditions that would make modern slums look luxurious. Families of 8 crammed into single rooms, children working 18-hour days in factories. Disease is spreading like wildfire through overcrowded tenements. And above it all, the wealthy grew wealthier. The gap between rich and poor wasn't just visible, it was obscene. While laborers died of starvation, the aristocracy threw lavish parties. While children worked their fingers to the bone, the elite debated philosophy in comfortable drawing rooms. The people of Southwark had endured years of this, years of watching their neighbors disappear into debtors' prisons, years of seeing their children grow thin and pale, years of being told to be grateful for their suffering. But on this particular day, July 16, 1814, something was different. There was electricity in the air. The kind of tension that makes dogs bark and makes people snap at the smallest irritation. Market day had been particularly brutal. Food prices had soared again. A loaf of bread, basic sustenance, cost more than many earned in a day. Mothers had returned home empty-handed, forced to tell their children there would be no supper. By evening, the local taverns were fuller than usual, not with celebration, but with desperation. Men drowning their sorrows in cheap gin, women nursing their anger over watered-down ale. Everyone is looking for someone to blame, someone to fight. The authorities knew trouble was brewing. They always did. But they made the same mistake they always made. They underestimated the people they had systematically oppressed. Because sometimes, when you push people too far, when you strip away everything they hold dear, when you leave them with nothing left to lose, all it takes is one small incident to unleash years of accumulated rage. And that incident was about to stumble down Bermondsey Street on 4 unsteady legs. Astor's the Pig and Whistle wasn't much to look at. A cramped tavern squeezed between a butcher's shop and a rag and bone dealer. Its windows were so grimy that sunlight struggled to penetrate the gloom inside. The floor was sticky with spilled beer and God knows what else. But for the working folk of Southwark, it was sanctuary, a place where a man could forget, for just a few hours, the weight of the world crushing down on his shoulders. The tavern's owner, Thomas Wickham, was known for his creative approach to business. He'd serve anyone who had coin and some who didn't. He'd water down the beer and call it refreshingly light. He'd serve day-old pie and claim it was aged to perfection. But Thomas had one peculiarity that set him apart from other publicans. He kept a pig, not for slaughter though many suggested he should, but as a sort of mascot, a massive, intelligent sow named Prudence. Prudence wasn't just any pig. She was clever, cunning even. She'd learned to open simple latches. She could sit on command. She even seemed to understand when the customers were getting too rowdy and would grunt disapprovingly. But Prudence had developed a taste for something that would prove to be her downfall: alcohol. It started innocently enough. A customer would spill beer, and Prudence would lap it up. Thomas thought it was amusing. The customers found it hilarious. Soon, people were deliberately pouring drinks for the pig. What they didn't realize was that Prudence had developed quite a tolerance and an appetite, and on this particular evening, she was about to consume far more than anyone intended. The trouble began when a traveling merchant, a man named Geoffrey Harrington, arrived at the tavern with a small barrel of what he claimed was the finest French brandy, liberated from Napoleon's own cellars. Whether it was actually French brandy or just rock gut with a fancy story, we'll never know, but it was potent. Strong enough to make grown men weep, strong enough to make the most hardened drinkers think twice, strong enough to get a 200-pound pig completely, utterly, catastrophically drunk. The merchant, eager to make sales, had been generous with his samples. Cup after cup was poured, and cup after cup Prudence managed to get her snout into. At first, it was just a few licks, then more. Then, at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, Thomas Wickham made a discovery that would change everything. The merchant's barrel, nearly full just hours before, was empty, and Prudence was drunk out of her mind. Now, you might think a drunken pig would be amusing, a curiosity, something to laugh about over breakfast the next morning. But Prudence wasn't just drunk, she was belligerent, aggressive, 200 pounds of intoxicated, angry pig. She charged at customers. She overturned tables. She knocked over a barrel of ale, sending precious liquid cascading across the floor. In a matter of minutes, the cheerful atmosphere of the tavern had transformed into chaos. Thomas tried to control her. The customers tried to help, but Prudence was beyond reason. She was a force of nature, fueled by alcohol and animal instinct. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, she stopped, looked around with bleary, unfocused eyes, and made a decision that would echo through history. She walked to the door, pushed it open with her snout, and stumbled out into the streets of Southwark. The customers rushed to the windows. They watched in horrified fascination as Prudence weaved down the street, knocking over market stalls, frightening horses, and generally causing havoc. "She'll tire herself out," Thomas muttered, already calculating the cost of the damage. "She'll find a corner and sleep it off." But Thomas didn't understand the neighborhood he lived in. He didn't understand the pressure, finger, or the desperation that had been building for months. He didn't understand that sometimes the smallest incident can trigger an avalanche. Because, at that exact moment, as Prudence stumbled through the streets of Southwark, she was about to encounter something that would transform her from a local curiosity into the catalyst for one of the most violent riots in Victorian England. She was about to meet Mrs. Eleanor Jameson. Eleanor Jameson had been having the worst day of her life, and considering she was a widow with 5 children living in a single room above a fishmonger's shop, that was saying something. She'd spent the morning at the workhouse, begging for assistance. Denied. The afternoon at the market, trying to buy food with coins that seemed to shrink in value every day. Failed. The evening was spent explaining to her children why there would be no supper again. Eleanor was 34 years old, but she looked 50. Her hands were raw from taking in washing, her back ached from scrubbing floors, her heart was breaking from watching her children grow thinner each day. On this particular evening, she'd made a desperate decision. She'd taken her last shilling money meant for rent and bought a small loaf of bread, stale bread, hard bread, but bread nonetheless. She was carrying it home, clutching it to her chest like a treasure, when she heard the commotion coming down the street, shouting, laughter, the sound of something heavy knocking over market stalls. And then she saw it, a massive pig, clearly intoxicated, weaving toward her with that particular single-minded determination that only drunk creatures possess. Eleanor didn't panic. She'd seen worse. She'd survived worse. She simply stepped aside, pressing herself against a building, waiting for the animal to pass. But Prudence, in her alcohol-fueled haze, had spotted something interesting, something that smelled wonderful, something that awakened every instinct in her pig brain: the bread. What happened next took less than 5 seconds, but it would be seared into Eleanor's memory forever. Prudence lunged. Eleanor stumbled backward. The bread flew from her hands, and in one swift motion, the pig devoured the only food Eleanor had been able to provide for her children. For a moment, the street was completely quiet. Eleanor stood frozen, staring at the crumbs on the cobblestones. Prudence, having satisfied her hunger, began to wander away. And then Eleanor, Jeanson, quiet, patient, long-suffering Eleanor screamed. It wasn't just anger. It was years of suppressed rage, desperation, and injustice pouring out in one primal cry. It was the sound of a mother who had nothing left to lose. My bread, my children's bread. People began to emerge from buildings, from alleys, from doorways. They'd heard that scream, and they recognized it. It was the sound of their own desperation reflected back at them. The pig ate her bread, someone shouted. The pig ate the children's bread. In any other place at any other time, this might have been resolved peacefully. Someone might have offered to buy Eleanor new bread. The pig's owner might have been found and made to pay compensation. But this wasn't any other place. This was Southwark. There weren't any other people. These were individuals who had been pushed beyond their breaking point. The crowd began to grow. Market vendors whose stalls had been knocked over, laborers who'd been drinking away their sorrows, children who'd been told there was no food at home. They all gathered around Eleanor, around the crumbs of bread, around the symbol of everything that was wrong with their world. Where's the owner? Someone demanded. Who's responsible for this? The crowd began to move, following Prudence's weaving path back toward the pig and whistle. And with each step, more people joined them. Window washers, seamstresses, dock workers, street sweepers. The forgotten masses of Victorian London, united by shared rage. Thomas Wickham saw them coming. He stood in his tavern doorway, watching the approaching mob with growing horror. This wasn't just a complaint about his pig. This was something much more dangerous. Bring out the pig, they shouted. Bring out the pig. But it wasn't really about the pig anymore. It was about everything. About the unfairness of life. About the system that kept them down. About the rage that had been building for years. Thomas tried to reason with them. He offered to pay for the bread. He promised to keep Prudence locked up. He even offered free drinks to anyone who would help calm the situation. But the crowd was beyond reason. They'd found their target, not just Prudence, but everything she represented. The carelessness of those who had more than enough, the casual cruelty of taking food from the hungry, the entire system that allowed such injustices to exist. Someone threw a stone. It struck the tavern window, sending Padero box across the glass. For a moment, everyone froze. And then the riot began. Tables and chairs came flying out of the tavern. Windows shattered up and down the street. The crowd, now grown to hundreds, began targeting anything that represented prosperity. The butcher's shop, the bakery, the clothier's stall. For 3 hours, Southwark burned with fury. Not literal fire, but the fire of human rage. People who had been silent for years suddenly found their voices. Hands that had been gentle suddenly became fists. The authorities, when they finally arrived, found a scene of devastation. Shops destroyed, streets covered in debris, and in the middle of it all, one confused, sobering pig, wondering what all the fuss was about. 23 people were arrested. Dozens more were injured. The damage to property was estimated at over £500, a fortune in 1814 money. But the real damage wasn't to buildings or merchandise. The real damage was to the illusion that society was stable, that the poor would always accept their fate quietly, that a pig eating bread couldn't start a revolution. Because sometimes the smallest acts of casual cruelty can unleash the largest explosions of human rage. The morning after the riot, Southwark looked like a battlefield. Broken glass crunched underfoot. Overturned carts lay scattered like fallen soldiers. The air still smelled of smoke and anger, but the most striking sight wasn't the physical damage. It was the people. They walked differently now, shoulders straighter, eyes meeting instead of avoiding. They had tasted power, however briefly, and they wouldn't forget it. The authorities launched an investigation, of course. They wanted to understand how such a minor incident could have escalated so quickly. They interviewed witnesses. They examined the evidence. They wrote reports. But they missed the point entirely. They saw a drunken pig and an overreaction. They didn't see the years of accumulated desperation. They didn't see the systemic failures that had created such explosive conditions. The magistrates sentenced the rioters to prison terms. They imposed fines that the defendants couldn't pay. They spoke of maintaining order and respecting property. They treated the symptoms while ignoring the disease. Thomas Wickham paid a heavy price for his pig's adventure. His tavern was destroyed. His reputation was ruined. He eventually left London, taking Prudence with him. Local legend says she never drank again. Eleanor Jameson, the woman whose bread had started it all, received an unexpected gift. The local community, moved by her story, raised enough money to help her family survive the winter. Small comfort, perhaps, but comfort nonetheless. But the real legacy of the pig riot, as it came to be known, wasn't the immediate aftermath. It was the warning it represented, a demonstration that social stability was far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The wealthy began to pay more attention to the conditions of the poor, not out of compassion necessarily, but out of fear. They had seen what could happen when desperation reached its breaking point, and the poor, they had learned something too. They had learned that they weren't powerless, that their anger, when focused, could shake the very foundations of society. The pig riot became a story passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the most significant events in history begin with the smallest causes, that sometimes justice isn't served in courtrooms or parliament, but in the streets. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that every person, no matter how poor, how forgotten, or how seemingly powerless, has a breaking point, and when that breaking point is reached, even a pig eating bread can start a revolution. As I researched this story, as I dove deep into the archives and court records, as I tried to understand how such an absurd incident could have such serious consequences, I kept coming back to one question. What does this tell us about ourselves? The pig riot of 1814 wasn't really about a pig. It was about human dignity. It was about the breaking point between patience and rage. It was about what happens when people feel they have nothing left to lose. I think about Eleanor Jameson, standing in that street, watching her children's bread disappear into the mouth of a drunken pig. I think about that moment, when patience transforms into fury, when resignation becomes revolution, and I realize that Eleanor's scream, that primal cry of desperation, echoes through history. It's the same cry that has sparked every uprising, every rebellion, every moment when the powerless decide they've had enough. We like to think we're different now, more civilized, more rational. We have social safety nets. We tell ourselves, we have democracy. We have systems in place to prevent such explosions of rage. But do we? Look around you? Look at the growing inequality. Look at the people working multiple jobs who still can't afford basic necessities. Look at the families choosing between rent and food. Look at the anger simmering just beneath the surface of our supposedly stable society. The pig may have been different, but the conditions that created that riot, desperation, inequality, the casual cruelty of those who have toward those who have not, those conditions haven't disappeared. They've just taken new forms. Every time someone makes a joke about the poor being lazy, every time someone suggests that hunger is a choice, every time someone dismisses the struggles of others as their own fault, they're creating the conditions for their own pig riot, because the truth is, we're all just one crisis away from desperation. We're all just one tragedy away from understanding why a pig eating bread could start a riot. I think about the people in power who dismissed the riot as mindless violence, who couldn't see that it was actually a very mindful response to mindless cruelty, who couldn't understand that when you systematically dehumanize people, you shouldn't be surprised when they stop behaving humanly. But I also think about the community that came together to help Eleanor after the riot, the people who saw her story and recognized their own struggles, the neighbors who understood that her fight was their fight, because that's the other lesson of the pig riot, that solidarity can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that sometimes it takes a moment of complete absurdity to reveal the deeper truths about our society. The pig didn't start the riot. The pig was just the catalyst. The riot was started by years of accumulated injustice, by a system that treated people as less important than property, and by a society that had forgotten that every person deserves dignity. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we honor the memory of Eleanor Jameson and all the forgotten people who have been pushed to their breaking point? We listen, we pay attention. We recognize that behind every senseless act of violence, there might be a very sensible response to senseless conditions. We ask ourselves, are we the pig owner, carelessly allowing our actions to harm others? Are we the authorities, dismissing legitimate grievances as disorder? Are we the bystanders, watching injustice unfold without acting? Or are we the neighbors who came together to help Eleanor? The people who saw beyond the immediate chaos to the deeper human needs, the individuals who understood that true order comes not from suppression, but from justice. The pig riot of 1814 lasted just 3 hours, but its lessons are eternal. It reminds us that every person has dignity, that every person has a breaking point, that sometimes the most important revolutions begin with the smallest acts of cruelty, and it reminds us that we all have a choice. We can be part of the system that creates desperation, or we can be part of the community that creates hope. The question isn't whether there will be more riots. The question is, what will we do to address the conditions that create them? Will we listen to the Eleanor Jamesons of our time before they're forced to scream? Will we see the warning signs before the breaking point is reached? Will we choose compassion over cruelty, justice over order, and understanding over dismissal? Because somewhere out there right now, someone is facing their own moment of desperation. Someone is watching their last hope disappear. Someone is deciding whether to suffer in silence or to fight back. And all it might take is one small act of casual cruelty, metaphorically speaking. One drunken pig eating one loaf of bread to remind us all that beneath the surface of our civilized society, the same human needs, the same human dignity, and the same human capacity for both patience and redress still exist. The pig in this story was named Prudence. Prudence, wisdom, careful judgment, the ability to avoid harm. How's that for irony? The creature that started the riot was named after a virtue that might have prevented it. Maybe that's the real lesson. Maybe we all need a little more prudence, a little more wisdom, a little more careful judgment about how our actions affect others, because in the end, the pig riot wasn't about a pig at all. It was about us, about our capacity for both cruelty and compassion, about our ability to ignore suffering until it explodes in our faces, about our power to create either desperation or hope. The choice, as it always has been, is ours. This story of the pig riot has stayed with me long after I finished researching it. It's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about people, real people facing real struggles, making real choices that echo through time. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about the world differently, I want you to do something. I want you to share it, not just this video, but the lesson behind it. Talk to your friends about the Eleanor Jamesons in your community. The people who are struggling are just out of sight. The individuals who are one crisis away from their own breaking point. Look for the warning signs, the casual cruelties, the systems that treat people as less important than property, the moments when society asks too much of those who have too little. And when you see those signs, don't wait for the riot, don't wait for the explosion. Act with the prudence that the pig in our story lacked. Choose compassion over indifference. Choose justice over order. Choose understanding over dismissal. I've started a discussion in the comments below. I want to hear your thoughts. Have you seen examples of how small incidents can reveal deeper social problems? Have you witnessed moments when communities came together to address injustice? What lessons from the pig riot do you think are most relevant today? And if you're struggling yourself, if you're facing your own moment of desperation, I want you to know that you're not alone. There are people who understand. There are communities willing to help. There are neighbors who recognize that your fight is their fight. Don't let the system convince you that your suffering is acceptable. Don't let anyone tell you that your needs don't matter. Don't let yourself be pushed to the breaking point without speaking up, because the real legacy of the pig riot isn't the destruction it caused. It's the reminder that change is possible, that people have power, that even the most entrenched systems can be shaken when enough people decide they've had enough. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories like this one. Stories that reveal the human drama behind historical events. Stories that remind us that the past isn't really past, it's still happening in different forms all around us. And remember, every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Every individual you encounter has their own struggles, their own breaking point, their own capacity for both patience and rage. The question isn't whether you'll encounter people in desperate situations. The question is, what will you do when you do? Will you be the pig owner, carelessly causing harm? Will you be the authority, dismissing legitimate grievances? Will you be the bystander, watching injustice unfold? Or will you be the neighbor who reaches out, the community member who listens, the person who understands that true stability comes not from suppression, but from ensuring that everyone has what they need to live with dignity? The choice, as it always has been, is yours. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for remembering that behind every historical event, no matter how absurd it might seem, there are real people with real struggles deserving of our attention and compassion. Until next time, keep questioning, keep listening, keep remembering that we're all just one crisis away from understanding we a pig eating bread could start a riot. And maybe, just maybe, that understanding will help us build a world where such riots are no longer necessary.